Philippa Marbrook leaned over the back of the chair, close enough that her perfume of orange flower and crushed violet brushed Anne's bare neck, and whispered 3 words she had been saving since the dressing bell. "Leave before you embarrass us." Anne Hartfield did not flinch. She set the unsipped glass of ratafia onto the satinwood console with the deliberate care of a person setting down a piece of evidence. Across the long room, where the chandeliers of Marbrook House threw their 100 candles down onto a crowd of strangers, the Duke of Ashworth was looking at her. He had been looking at her for some moments. Now his gaze did not move. Behind her, Philippa straightened. She was wearing rose-pink silk with seed pearls along the bodice, and her smile was the smile of a hostess who has just settled a small domestic question. Beside Anne, on the cushioned bench, the engagement ring she had been given 2 hours earlier sat on her gloved finger, like something that had landed there by accident. "Did you understand me, my dear?" Philippa said, in her ordinary voice now, as though they had been discussing the music. "Edmund will be embarrassed if you remain. He is too kind to send you away himself. Allow me to spare him the trouble." Anne stood. Her grandmother's pearls, the only thing she had brought into this house 6 months ago that they had not been able to lift from her, swung once at her ears as she rose, and was still. She felt nothing she could not control. That was the discipline of 7 months in this house. You felt nothing you could not control. "Quite," she said, evenly. "You have been very clear." She walked the length of the long room, past the trio playing Pleyel, past the Dowager Lady Marbrook with her ostrich feathers nodding, past the small islands of silk and velvet and gloved hands holding glasses. And she did not look at the Duke of Ashworth as she passed within 4 feet of him. She did not look at anyone. She walked out of the drawing room and into the marble-floored vestibule, and there she stopped, because she had no coat, no carriage, and no place in London to go. The double doors of the drawing room opened behind her. They closed. "Miss Hartfield." It was the Duke. She had heard him speak only twice before, briefly, at dinners she had been seated at the opposite end of. His voice was low enough that the footman by the door pretended not to be in the room. She turned. "Your Grace? You have no carriage?" "No. I have one. It is at the gate. It is yours, if you will permit me." A pause. "Where would you like to be taken?" She had not, until that moment, permitted herself to consider where she would like to be taken. The question, clean, practical, requiring an answer, landed in her chest with a force she had not been expecting. She felt her composure lean, very slightly, the way a wall leans the moment before it falls. "I do not know," she said. The Duke of Ashworth did not look at her with pity. That was, she would think later, the thing she remembered first. But he looked at her the way a man looks at an account that is owed to him, an account he intends to settle. "Then permit me to suggest a destination," he said. "My sister keeps a house in Berkeley Square. Lady Beatrice will have a fire, a bed, and no questions. By morning we may discuss what comes next." Behind them, through the drawing-room doors, somebody laughed. "Your sister does not know me," Anne said. "She will be glad to," said the Duke. "She has been wishing for someone to argue with about the Caroline of Brunswick affair, and her usual partner is a parrot." Anne almost, very nearly, smiled. "Very well." He offered his arm. She did not take it. She walked beside him instead, 2 steps clear of his shoulder, and a footman opened the front door, and the cold, spring night air of London came into the vestibule like water poured into a cup. It tasted of coal smoke and wet horse, and the faint, distant green of new lime leaves on the trees in the square. She drew it into her lungs the way a swimmer breaks the surface. The carriage was a town brougham, dark blue, no crest. The crest had been ordered plain. She noticed the absence and filed it. He handed her up the step, gloved fingers, the briefest contact, and climbed in after her, and closed the door himself rather than wait for the footman, and rapped twice on the roof. The carriage moved. Inside, The dark was complete except for the 2 squares of yellow gaslight from the street lamps as they passed. He sat opposite her, hat in his lap, and did not speak. After a moment, Anne said, "May I ask you a question, Your Grace?" "Yes." "How long had you been watching me?" A pause. The carriage rocked gently over the cobbles of Grosvenor Street. "Since you came in," he said, 2.5 hours. "That was before Lady Philippa spoke to me?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because your father's name was Henry Hartfield," said the Duke of Ashworth, "and I've been waiting 11 years to repay him a debt." The carriage rolled on. Anne watched the gaslight slide across the back of his glove and across his ring and across his glove again. She set her hands very carefully in her lap. 11 years ago, she had been 14, and her father had been alive, and she had not yet learned that grief was a country with weather of its own. "My father," she said, "knew a great many young men. He was a generous correspondent." She paused. "If you intend to make me cry in this carriage, Your Grace, I would prefer you save it until morning. I am very tired." "I do not intend to make you cry." "Then what do you intend?" "To get you safely to my sister's house," said the Duke, "and then, in the morning, to ask you what you would like to do with the rest of your life. After which, if your answer is anything I can be useful to, I will attempt to be useful." She looked at him, in the moving rectangles of gaslight and shadow, and saw a man younger than she had supposed, 27 at most, 28 perhaps, with the heavy shoulders of a man who had spent more time on horseback than in drawing rooms, and the steady grey eyes of a man who had decided long before tonight what he meant to do, and was simply executing it now. "You did not happen," she said slowly, "to be at the Marbrooks tonight?" "No." "You came for me?" "I came," said the Duke, "to see whether what I had heard was true. I have heard a great deal about how Lady Philippa conducts herself in her own house. I wished to see it. Now I have." "And you are the only Duke who could ruin them," Anne said. She did not mean to say it aloud. It was a phrase that had been moving around the back of her thoughts for a quarter of an hour, since she had seen the Marbrook bankers exchange glances when her host arrived. It came out of her now with the wry, exhausted clarity of a person too tired to soften the truth. The Duke of Ashworth's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. "It would be more accurate," he said, "to say I am the only Duke who has been preparing to." The carriage turned into Berkeley Square. The brougham slowed. Through the window, Anne saw a tall, stone-faced house with a fanlight burning gold above the door, and a footman already coming down the steps with a lantern. She gathered her gloves more tightly, the way a soldier gathers reins before dismounting, and made herself ready to walk into a strange house, on a stranger's word, with no possessions but the pearl earrings of a grandmother she could barely remember. The Duke handed her down. The lantern caught the side of his face, briefly. Clean-shaven jaw. The slight unevenness of an old scar above the eyebrow. The patience of a man who has decided to wait for an answer. "Miss Hartfield." "Your Grace." "You owe me nothing for this," he said. "Whatever you decide in the morning, you owe me nothing. I'm settling an account that was opened before you were born." Anne said, "We shall see," because that was the only honest reply she had in her, and they went up the lantern-lit steps together to the door of Lady Beatrice Ashworth's house, and the door opened, and the night ended. Lady Beatrice Ashworth was 24, half a head shorter than her brother, with the same grey eyes and a head of dark hair piled in a riot of escaping curls, and she came down the stairs in a dressing gown of deep amber silk, holding a candle in one hand and an open book in the other. "Theodore," she said, without surprise, "it is past 1. Have you brought me a guest or a problem?" "A guest," said the Duke. "With no luggage and no maid," said Beatrice, taking Anne in with a single calm sweep of her glance. "And in evening dress." She set the book down on the hall table. Anne saw the title, A French History of the Restoration, and held out her hand. Miss Hartfield, I think. I was at school with a cousin of yours. You are very welcome. Mrs. Hewitt? A motherly woman in a starched cap appeared at the top of the stairs, as though she had been waiting for the word. The blue room, said Beatrice. And a fire. And, I think, a tray. Soup, if cook has any. Bread and butter if she has not. Miss Hartfield is not to be required to make conversation tonight. I can, Anne began. You cannot, said Beatrice firmly, with a smile that had nothing of pity in it, and everything of decision. You are so tired you have forgotten how to use the muscles of your face. I know that look. My brother looks like that twice a year. He is allowed to apply for entry to my house in that condition. So are you. Theodore, the breakfast room at 9. We will discuss things then, if Miss Hartfield is rested. Good night, my dear. Anne found that her hand had been pressed, briefly and warmly, between Beatrice's two warm palms. Then she was being conducted up a wide staircase by Mrs. Hewitt, into a corridor smelling faintly of beeswax and cut hyacinth, and into a room papered in pale blue, with a fire already lit, where someone had laid out a clean linen nightdress that was the wrong size, in a way that suggested it was Beatrice's own. Mrs. Hewitt closed the door without a single question. Anne stood very still in the middle of the carpet. Then she took out her grandmother's pearls, set them on the dresser, and put one hand against the bedpost the way a sailor holds a mast, not for comfort, but against capsizing. She did not cry. She had not cried in 7 months. She did not start now. But she sat down, very slowly, on the edge of the strange bed, in a strange house, in a borrowed nightdress that smelt of lavender, and for the first time since Henry Hartfield had been carried home from a hunting field with his neck broken, she felt the hard, small fact of being still alive sit down beside her like a companion. Then she lay back against the pillow, and the fire burned low, and the church bells of Mayfair counted out 2 and 3 and 3:15, and she slept. She woke to the smell of coffee. For a moment, in the blue-grey light of London morning, before the maids had come to draw the curtains, she did not know where she was. Then she remembered, in a single plain sentence delivered to her by her own mind. You walked out of the Marbrooks. There is no going back. She sat up. The pearl earrings were on the dresser. The dressing-table mirror reported a pale young woman with auburn hair coming down out of last night's pins, hazel eyes that had decided to be steady, and a mouth that had decided not to apologize. She did not know where her trunks were. She did not know whether the Marbrooks would send them. She did not know what she would wear to breakfast. A soft knock. Mrs. Hewitt entered with a basin of warm water, and over her arm, a morning gown of pale dove-grain muslin, trimmed with a single blue ribbon. Lady Beatrice's, miss. She bid me say it would be a poor fit at the bust, but a very forgiving one at the waist, and to please not stand on ceremony. Anne almost smiled. Thank you. I am, at the moment, entirely without ceremony. That is no shame, miss, said Mrs. Hewitt comfortably, setting down the basin. It is the great freedom of a guest. Anne washed. She dressed. The gown fit, more or less, in the way that a borrowed gown fits when both women are slim and the lender has been kind. She pinned up her hair as well as she could without a maid, and she went down the stairs of a strange house in Berkeley Square on the morning of the first day of her independent life, holding her grandmother's earrings in one closed palm, because she had been too distracted to put them on. The Duke of Ashworth and his sister were already at breakfast. The breakfast room looked east. The morning sun came through the long sash windows in 3 clean rectangles and fell on a table laid with silver and white china and a bowl of cut hyacinth. And the Duke rose when she entered, as was correct, and Lady Beatrice did not, because she had already made it clear that she did not require Anne to perform. There you are, said Beatrice. Coffee or tea? Theodore has bullied cook into producing toast in the French style, which means it has been incinerated. Avoid the toast. Coffee, please. The Duke poured it himself. He did this without fuss, the way a man pours coffee when he has long since decided it is not a task that requires a footman. He set the cup at her place. Their fingers did not touch this time. She noticed the not touching, and filed that too. She sat. She drank the coffee. It was excellent. After a moment, Beatrice said pleasantly, "I have written to the Marbrooks." Anne's cup stopped halfway to her mouth. "Have you?" A short note, politely worded, to the effect that you are with me, and that any luggage of yours that happens to find itself loaded onto a hackney coach by 10 this morning will be very gratefully received at the area door. I have implied, without quite saying so, that the Duke of Ashworth is taking a personal interest in your well-being. The Marbrooks, who have been borrowing rather rashly from one of my brother's banking acquaintances for some time now, will read between the lines. "Beatrice," said the Duke quietly. "I have not lied," said Beatrice. "I have informed." "You have arranged." "It is the same word in this house," said Beatrice. "Eat your incinerated toast." Anne set her cup down. She felt herself smile. Properly, this time. The kind of smile a person feels rising before they decide whether to let it. She let it. "You rode to the Marbrooks at, what, 7:30 this morning?" "7 exactly. I was awake, so was Mrs. Hewitt. The hackney is a private one, with my coachman's brother on the box. He has been instructed to refuse any inquiries except a polite goodbye." Beatrice buttered her toast. "I did not consult you, Miss Hartfield. I apologize for that. But I judged that if I waited until breakfast to ask, you would say it was not necessary, and that you would manage. And I judged that what you required this morning was for someone to manage on your behalf. For one morning only." Anne discovered, quite suddenly, that she had to set the coffee cup down because her hand was no longer entirely steady. She set it down. She put both hands in her lap, palms together, the way a woman holds her hands when she is making sure they will not betray her. "Lady Beatrice," she said, "I do not know how to thank you." "Then do not," said Beatrice cheerfully. "Eat, and, when you are ready, my brother has something to say to you which he has been rehearsing all night, and which he is, just now, dreading." The Duke set down his coffee. He did not look as though he was dreading anything, but he did, Anne saw, press his thumb very briefly against the gold of his signet ring, once, hard, before he spoke. "Miss Hartfield." "Your Grace?" "In 1808, your father lent me a sum of money that saved my mother's life. She had taken a fall in Wexford. A London surgeon needed to be brought quickly, and at that time my own affairs were in disorder. Your father heard of it, and rode to my aunt's house in the rain to offer the loan in person, with no security and no terms, on the single condition that I should never speak of it." He paused. Anne did not move. "My mother lived another 4 years. Your father died in 1815. I tried twice to repay the loan to his estate, but the estate had passed through 3 sets of solicitors, and the second set had irregularities that made it impossible to be sure the repayment would reach his daughter. By the time I had untangled the matter, the estate was gone. You were a ward of the Marbrooks, and I had been informed that you were to marry Lord Edmund. I did not, at that point, see how I could be useful. So I waited." "You waited?" Anne repeated. "I purchased certain Marbrook obligations as they came onto the market," said the Duke, very evenly. "I had been doing so for 2.5 years. I now hold the majority of their unsecured debt. Last week I was informed by a friend in their bank that Lord Edmund's engagement to you was being publicly celebrated, as proof that the family had, and I quote, secured the Hartfield estate against further leakage to creditors." Anne sat very still. "In short," said the Duke, "I learned that the marriage was not, on their part, a marriage. It was a debt management strategy. And I came to the engagement ball last night to see whether you knew." "I did not know." "That was clear." "I had been told," Anne said, slowly, "that there was some Hartfield property, yet unsold. That my dowry had been arranged from it. That Edmund's father had done me the great kindness of housing me, and that the marriage was—" a matter of long-standing affection between the two families. Was it presented as a matter of affection? It was presented, said Anne, as a matter of inevitability, which, in the Marbrook house, is a different kind of pressure. Beatrice put her hand briefly over Anne's wrist and removed it. Miss Hartfield, said the Duke, I'm telling you because, as of this morning, you are the only person not in their employment who knows the actual financial position of the Marbrook family. That information is power. It is also heavy. I would like your permission to share that weight. Meaning? Meaning, said the Duke, that I propose to settle on you, in trust, an income equivalent to the loan your father made me, compounded at a fair rate over the years it has been outstanding. That income is yours, regardless of what you decide next. Walk out of this house at 11 and never see me again. Or remain in London under your own name, or take a cottage in Hampshire. Refuse it, and I shall disperse it to the parish your father served. The trust is irrevocable on my part, and entirely at your disposal. That is the debt. He paused. What I would like, separately from the debt, is your permission to act, with you and not on your behalf, in the matter of the Marbrooks. Lady Philippa whispered to you to leave because she imagined you were powerless. You are not. I should like that to become very widely known. The breakfast room was very quiet. Outside, in Berkeley Square, a milk cart was passing. Inside, the Duke of Ashworth was watching Anne Hartfield with no expression at all, which she now recognized as the expression of a man who had decided that whatever she answered, he would honor. She thought. She drank a sip of coffee, which had gone cold, and did not feel it. She set the cup down. Your Grace, she said. Miss Hartfield. I will accept the trust. I will not walk out of this house at 11, and I will give you my permission to act in the matter of the Marbrooks, but on 3 conditions. Name them. First, you will not attempt to spare me. Whatever you do, I do with you. I have spent 7 months being managed kindly by people who thought I could not bear to know my own situation. I cannot endure another minute of it. If we proceed as partners or not at all. The Duke's mouth moved, not quite a smile. Agreed. Second, you will not pay Philippa Marbrook back for what she said to me. You will not seek a private revenge on my behalf. The Marbrooks have done worse to other people than they have done to me. If we proceed because they have earned it from London, not because they have offended me. A pause. Then, agreed. Third. Anne hesitated. The third condition was the one she had not planned. It came out of her now anyway. Your sister has just done me one of the great kindnesses of my life. I should like, if she will have me, to be of some service to her in return. A companion, a secretary, something useful. I cannot remain here as a guest. I will not remain here as anything that resembles a charity. Beatrice clapped her hands together once, with the delight of a woman who has been hoping for this outcome since 7 o'clock that morning. Done, she said. I have been writing a history of the Stuart court for 4 years, and my eyesight is failing me in the evenings. You will read to me 3 nights a week. The 4th and 5th nights you may do as you please. The 6th and 7th you will accompany me to whatever appalling event Theodore has arranged. I shall pay you £80 a year, and you will have your own sitting room. Do you accept? I accept. Then it is done. Beatrice rose. Theodore, you may stay, or you may go to your club. Miss Hartfield, the morning is yours. Mrs. Hewitt has set up a writing desk in the small parlour. I imagine you will wish to write to your old governess. Letter paper is in the second drawer. Beatrice swept out. The Duke did not follow her. After a moment, he said quietly, You are very like him. Like whom? Your father. Anne looked down at her cold coffee. He used to say something, she said, when I was small. When I'd been knocked down by a pony, or by a cousin, or by anything. He used to say, Stand where you mean to be standing. And then he would not help me up. The Duke did not speak. He said it to you, didn't he? Anne said, without looking up. He said it to me, said the Duke, the night he gave me the loan. Anne folded her hands in her lap, very carefully. Then we know each other already, Your Grace, she said, in a manner of speaking. Shall we begin? Her trunks arrived at 10:30. There were 2 of them, hastily corded, smelling faintly of the Marbrook cellar where they had been stored for 6 months, because Philippa had been unwilling to give Anne a room with proper press space. On top of the larger trunk, a torn-open note in Lady Marbrook's hand. Miss Hartfield, your effects. Lord Edmund will be calling on Berkeley Square at 3 to discuss the misunderstanding. Pray be at home, ML. Anne read it twice. She did not show it to Beatrice. She set it on the writing desk in the small parlour, weighted it with a paper knife, and went upstairs to unpack. By 11, she had folded 3 day dresses and a single evening gown, a muslin of deep emerald that had been her mother's, and that the Marbrooks had not been able to find a use for, into the lavender-papered drawers of the blue room. She had hung up her 2 pairs of gloves. She had set out, on the dressing table, the small leather case that had accompanied her since girlhood, a miniature of her father, painted when he was 26, looking out from the ivory disc with the calm grey eyes of a man who already knew he intended to spend his life being useful. She stood for a moment, looking at it. Then she closed the case. Then she went down to the small parlour and wrote, in 15 minutes, a letter to her old governess in Hampshire that contained no self-pity, no theatrical apologies, and a small piece of London gossip about a parrot. It was the easiest letter she had written in 7 months. She sealed it. She felt, for the first time in those 7 months, like a woman with a chair and a desk and a window of her own. At 3 o'clock, Edmund Marbrook arrived. He was shown into the small parlour by Mrs. Hewitt, who announced him in a tone so neutral that Anne, watching from the window seat where she had been reading, had to bend her head briefly so that he would not see her smile. Edmund Marbrook was 26, fair-haired, slim-shouldered, well-bred in the slightly soft way of a young man whose mother had ironed his collars for him until the day he went up to Oxford. He had the kind of face that asked, before its owner had spoken, to be liked. He took her hands. She let him, briefly, and then withdrew them. Anne, he said, I have come about last night. There has been a most dreadful misunderstanding. Has there? Philippa is desolated. She has been weeping in her room since breakfast. She could not have meant what she said. She had been at the punch, you see. When she is at the punch, she is not herself. Edmund, said Anne pleasantly. Philippa was not at the punch. Philippa was nowhere near the punch. Philippa was sober as a curate, and what she said to me she had been preparing all afternoon. I was there. So was she. He blinked. He had a tell when he was being lied to or when he was lying. He blinked twice in rapid succession and then looked at the carpet. He did so now. You are upset, he said. I am not upset. I am clear. Anne. Edmund, please sit down. I should like to spare us both a long scene. He sat. He looked now very much like a man whose mother had sent him with a script. You are returning home with me this afternoon, he said, with the careful gentleness of a man reading the script aloud. We have arranged, Mamma has arranged, for the wedding to be brought forward to early June. The settlements have been signed. The notice will go to the Gazette on Tuesday. There is no occasion for any of this. He gestured at the parlour, the unfamiliar small brass blotting weight on the desk, the single hyacinth in a glass. There is no occasion for any of this. There is. Anne. Edmund, look at me. He looked. He had blue eyes, a shade paler than his sister's. He had, and Anne saw it now, as she had not quite let herself see it before, the kind of blue eyes that looked like a child's. Not because there was anything innocent in them, but because there was no decision in them. Whatever decision was in his life, it had been made by someone else. Whose decision was the wedding? She asked. Ours. Whose, Edmund? Mamma's. Philippa's. We agreed it together, as a family, as we agreed everything. Did you ever, said Anne gently, want to marry me? Edmund opened his mouth. Edmund closed his mouth. Edmund blinked twice in rapid succession and looked at the carpet. Yes, he said. She did not laugh. She did not weep. She felt, very faintly, almost sorry for him, for the third time in this conversation, and for the last. Edmund, she said, I cannot marry you. Not in June. Not next year. Not in any month any of us could think of. The reason is not Philippa. The reason is that the engagement was contrived to settle Marbrook debts, and we both know it. And you have not the strength to say so to your mother. And I have not, any longer, the patience to pretend you do. Anne, I will say one kind thing to you, she said, and then I will ask you to leave. The kind thing is this. I do not blame you. I think you are a man your mother has made smaller than you needed to be, and I think you have not yet decided whether you mind. When you decide, Edmund, I shall be very glad to hear from you. But I do not propose to wait in your mother's house while you decide. I propose to make my own life. Will you go? Edmund did not move. Anne, he said, I am to be ruined. She did not flinch. By what? The settlements that were signed against the marriage. They mature in October. If there is no marriage, they fall in. The bank has given Mamma until then. After that, the bank will sell the obligations to a man who will collect them in earnest. I know. I was informed of it this morning. He stared. By whom? By the man who holds them. A long, long pause. Anne listened to a clock she had not yet heard before. A slim French clock on the mantel, ticking with the precise, uninvolved patience of a thing that had survived 2 revolutions. Anne, said Edmund slowly, whose carriage left with you last night? The Duke of Ashworth's. You stayed at his sister's house? Yes. He went, in perfect order, white. Anne watched the colour leave his face the way water leaves a porcelain bowl. She did not enjoy it, but she did not look away. Anne! Anne! His voice had gone quiet. Do you know what they will say? About the carriage. About staying the night in his sister's house. I will be made to fight him. Mamma will make me. I cannot fight the Duke of Ashworth, Anne. I have never fired a... I have never... Then don't, said Anne, and for the first time her voice rose. It rose only a little, because she was Anne Hartfield, and her voice rarely rose. But she heard the lift in it, and so did Edmund, and so did Mrs. Hewitt, who had been waiting by the door. Don't fight him, Edmund. Tell your mother that you will not fight him. Tell her that the engagement is broken because you broke it, not because I did. Tell her you discovered a financial arrangement you could not, as a gentleman, take part in. Tell her anything that is true and that you can stand behind. You will be ruined less by the truth than by the lies your mother is going to ask you to tell. He stared at her. Anne, who had spent 6 months watching Edmund Marbrook avoid every opportunity to choose, saw the flicker now, behind the soft blue eyes, of a man considering, briefly, what it might be to choose. It passed. I cannot, he said. I know, said Anne. Mamma, I know, Edmund. He stood. He stood the way a man stands when he has run out of all the lines on his side of the page. He bowed. He left. Mrs. Hewitt closed the door behind him with the merest, most polite, most British of clicks, and Anne sat down in the window seat and put her hand for a moment over her mouth and breathed. After a moment a footstep came along the corridor and the parlour door opened. and the Duke of Ashworth came in. He had not been in the parlour during the interview. He had not been listening. He had been, by his own arrangement, in a chair by the front door for the entire half-hour, with a book. Has he gone? He has. Are you well? I am, yes. She looked up. Yes. The Duke crossed to the window and looked out into Berkeley Square. The afternoon had clouded over. The spring light had gone silver. He stood with his hands clasped behind him and watched a nursemaid herd two small girls in pinafores past the railings. After a moment, he said, without turning, I owe you an apology. For what? I underestimated him. Edmund? Edmund. I assumed he would arrive with bluster and threats. I assumed I would have to discourage him. I find, by listening through a door I had no business listening through, that he arrived terrified, and that you spared him, and that you sent him home in better repair than you found him. Did I? You did. He is going to lie to his mother. He is, but you gave him an option, Miss Hartfield. He may not take it. He may. Either way, the option came from you. That was generous. I should not have known to do it. She laughed, suddenly, and it surprised her. You would have terrified him on the front step. I would have terrified him in the carriage on the way over, said the Duke, which is why I was sitting in a chair by the door instead. Beatrice took the front step from me by force at 20 minutes past 2. Where is Lady Beatrice? At her writing desk. She is composing a list. Of what? Of all the people in London who owe her a favour, and who have, at one time or another, been to a Marbrook dinner. She intends, I think, to write them all by Friday. Beatrice's lists are instructive. She has been waiting to write this one for 3 years. Anne put her face briefly into her hands. When she removed them, her eyes were dry, and she was, not laughing exactly, but not far from it. Your Grace, she said. What happens next? Next? We wait 3 days. The Gazette notice will not appear on Tuesday. By Wednesday, a society murmur that a young heiress under Beatrice's protection has quietly released Lord Edmund. By Friday, Beatrice's list goes out. By Sunday, the Marbrooks find their lines of credit have stopped extending. And on Monday? The Duke turned from the window. On Monday, he said, we begin work. There is evidence in the Marbrook accounts of irregularities going back 12 years. I've had a partial audit performed, discreetly. The auditor is not, by training, familiar with how an estate runs. You are. Your father trained you to read a steward's book before you could ride side-saddle. He told me so in 1808, with great pride. I should like, with your permission, to ask for your help. My help? Your help. Specifically, the hour or two a day you can spare from Beatrice's history of the Stuart court. The auditor will come here. The papers will be brought here. We will not visit any house we have not been invited to. We will not break a single law. We will simply read. You wish me to read? I wish us to read. She thought. Very well, she said. The Duke inclined his head, once, briefly, and said, Thank you, Miss Hartfield. And then, because they were not going to talk about it any further today, he asked her whether she would care for a turn around the square before the rain came in earnest, and she said yes, and they went out into the cooling afternoon, and Beatrice watched them from her writing-room window, and added a name to her list, and smiled to herself, and turned the page. The auditor's name was Mr. Bickersmith. He was a small, narrow, very quiet man in a brown coat, whose every pocket bulged with tied papers. He arrived at the Berkeley Square house on Monday at 9 in the morning, with 2 leather satchels, one for ledgers, one for correspondence, and a smaller bag from which, in the course of the morning, he produced 4 pencils, an apple, and a small canister of green tea that he insisted on brewing himself. The Duke set up the small parlour as a working room. The hyacinth was moved, the writing desk was extended with a leaf. By 9:30, the table was covered in ledgers, and the room smelt of old leather and beeswax. Anne came in at 9:45 in a plain morning gown of grey worsted. Beatrice had pinned a single sprig of rosemary to her shoulder. "For memory," said Beatrice, "and because you look entirely too solemn." "I am entirely too solemn." "Nonsense. You are dressed like a lady going to war. War requires a sprig of something." The Duke rose from a chair when Anne entered. Mr. Bickersmith rose halfway, blinked, sat down again, and then rose properly with a small bow of recovery. He had been told who Anne was. He had not been told that she would be working with him. "Miss Hartfield," said the Duke. "Mr. Bickersmith. Mr. Bickersmith, you will be working with Miss Hartfield, who knows estate accounts in the way that you know London banking, that is, professionally. Miss Hartfield, Mr. Bickersmith has been examining the Marbrook books for 3 weeks. He has questions. I think, before we proceed, you should hear what he has." Mr. Bickersmith looked, for the first time in 15 minutes, very nearly comfortable. He had a question. He put on his spectacles. He turned to the third ledger from the left. "Ladies and gentlemen," said Mr. Bickersmith softly, "it is my opinion that the Marbrook estate has been, for at least the last 12 years, paying the wages of 19 tenants on the Greycoat Farms in Wiltshire, who do not, in fact, exist." Anne went still. The room went still. "Greycoat," she said. "Greycoat, ma'am. The Greycoat estate, lying west of Salisbury. It was attached to the late Mr. Henry Hartfield's holdings until, to my present understanding, 1815, when it passed by deed to the Marbrook family in lieu of certain debts. I have been unable to locate the original deed. I have located the entry of conveyance in the Marbrook ledgers. The conveyance is irregular." "Irregular how?" "In the matter of signature." The Duke had gone very quiet. Anne saw, in the corner of her eye, that his thumb had pressed once, hard, against his ring. "Mr. Bickersmith," he said, "whose signature is on the conveyance?" "Mr. Henry Hartfield's, sir, dated the 14th of October, 1815. "My father," said Anne, "died on the 5th of October, 1815. The room held its breath. Mr. Bickersmith took off his spectacles. He cleaned them with a square of yellow cotton. He put them back on. He turned the ledger toward Anne with the careful, sad courtesy of a man who has found a wound he cannot heal, but can, at least, dress. "That, Miss Hartfield," he said, "is what I have spent 3 weeks suspecting. I should like, very much, to be wrong." Anne looked at the page. The handwriting was a fair, slightly slanted hand that her father had not used since he was a young man in his 20s, when his fingers were lighter on the pen. By 1815, he had had a rheumatism in his right thumb that gave his signature a small, distinctive jog, visible in every letter she had received from him in the 4 years before his death. The signature on the page had no jog. "You are not wrong," said Anne quietly. "The signature is forged." "I am sorry, Miss Hartfield." "Don't be sorry. Ma'am, don't be sorry," she said again, and her voice this time was the voice she had used in the carriage on the night of the ball. Even, almost light, the voice of a woman who has decided not to break in this particular weather. "I have spent 7 months living in a house that took my father's land before he was buried. I have spent 7 months being told that the Marbrooks were generous to me. I am not sorry. I am clarified." She set her hand flat on the page beside the forged signature. She looked at the Duke of Ashworth. He met her eyes. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Hartfield. Greycoat was my mother's house. I was born there. My father is buried in the chapel there. I would very much like Greycoat back." "Then we will get it back." "Within the law." "Within the law." "How long?" 6 weeks, said the Duke. 8 at the worst. Mr. Bickersmith's audit, plus a sworn deposition from the Marbrook estate steward, who I have reason to believe will swear it without resistance. After that, we shall require a private hearing in Chancery. Lord Eldon owes me a court day."
8 weeks, said Anne. Very well. Let us begin.
Mr. Bickersmith took up his pencil. The Duke seated himself at the far end of the long table. Anne opened the second ledger from the left and began to read down the columns of the year 1815 with the focused, unhurried attention of a woman who had been waiting, although she had not entirely known it, to do exactly this for 7 months. By noon, they had found 3 more forged signatures. By tea, 6. By dinner, the Duke had sent a private rider to a man in Wiltshire, and Anne worked on by candlelight beside the man who had, 11 years before, been given a loan in the rain by her father, and who was now, page by page, settling a debt that had grown a great deal larger than any of them had reckoned. The work had a rhythm. Mornings were Mr. Bickersmith's. Green tea, a pencil sharpened to a needle, ledger after ledger placed in the center of the long table, while he and Anne read the columns aloud, item by item, the way 2 people might read the lines of a play. The Duke arrived when his work permitted, stayed as long as he was useful, and when he had nothing to add, he left them to it. By the end of the first week, Anne could tell, without looking up when he came into the room, the soft creak of the carpet by the door, the faint smell of the open air on his coat. She would feel her shoulders, of their own accord, lower a 1/4 of an inch when he entered. After the first week, he had taken to setting a small glass with a fresh cut of hyacinth at the corner of her ledger when he came. He did this without comment. "He took our mother 1 cut flower at every visit in the last year," Beatrice said, on the Saturday, walking in the garden. "He said it kept his hands occupied on the road. I have always thought it kept something else occupied. I tell you because I would not like you to misread it as routine. Beatrice, I am not in a position—" "Of course you are not. My brother," said Beatrice cheerfully, "has promised himself he will not say a single thing to you, on any subject not strictly to do with the audit, until Greycoat is back in your name. I tell you only because it would be unfair to make a promise like that, and have nobody warn you that he has made it. You are warned. I shall now stop interfering. Thank you." Beatrice slipped her arm through hers, briefly. "I have wanted a sister since I was 8. Theodore is no substitute." On the Monday of the second week, Edmund Marbrook called again. Mrs. Hewitt did not show him in. She did not, in fact, allow him past the front step. She returned to the small parlour with a card on a silver tray and a faintly amused expression. "Lord Edmund," she said, "is requesting an interview. He says it is urgent. He says he has, and I quote, Ma'am, information that Miss Hartfield will wish to hear." "Show him in," said Anne, before the Duke could speak. The Duke looked at her. "You are sure?" "I am sure." "In here? With the ledgers?" "In here, with the ledgers. Mr. Bickersmith, I am very sorry. Would you mind closing that book and sitting on it for a 1/4 of an hour? Thank you. Mrs. Hewitt, show him in." Edmund came in. He had not slept. That was visible from the door. His collar was less than perfect. His hair, parted with the usual care, had a stray, fair lock falling over one temple that he had not bothered this morning to push back. He stopped at the centre of the carpet when he saw the Duke. He looked from the Duke to the table, to Anne, and back again. His mouth opened. His mouth closed.
"Lord Edmund,"
said Anne pleasantly.
"Anne, Miss Hartfield, your Grace, forgive me, I had hoped to find Miss Hartfield alone."
"Anything you have to say to Miss Hartfield," said the Duke evenly, "you may say in front of me, or you may say in your carriage on the way home. Miss Hartfield's choice." Anne nodded.
"Then I will hear him," she said.
Edmund swallowed. He came no further into the room. "Anne, I have not been able to sleep. Mamma says I'm to call you home. Mamma is... I cannot describe the temper my mother has been in for the last week. I did not come here to fetch you. I came here to warn you. Mamma has...
She has decided that Lady Philippa is going to call upon Lady Beatrice this afternoon. Beatrice, who had been sitting in the deep window seat with her embroidery, and who had been quite still until that moment, set down her needle with the sharp, satisfied click of a woman who had been waiting for a piece of news with great interest. "Has she?" said Beatrice.
"Yes, my lady."
"With what intention, Lord Edmund?"
"With the intention," said Edmund miserably, of having a frank, sisterly conversation with Miss Hartfield. With the intention, Mamma hopes, of persuading Miss Hartfield to return home before the matter goes further. And your sister has agreed to make this call." "Eagerly, my lady." "At what o'clock?" 3. Beatrice rose from the window seat. She crossed to the bell. She rang it. "Mrs. Hewitt," she said when the housekeeper appeared, "I shall be receiving Lady Philippa Marbrook at 3 o'clock. The drawing room, tea, the little Sèvres cups, the green ones, the almond biscuits, the card tray on the small table by the fire. And Mrs. Hewitt, I should be very grateful if Miss Hartfield's tray were laid up here, in the small parlour, at 3:30. Miss Hartfield will be working through the afternoon and is not, on any account, at home today." Mrs. Hewitt bowed her head and went. "Lord Edmund," said Beatrice cheerfully, "you have been very kind to bring this warning. I shall return the kindness. Tell your mother, when you go home, that Lady Philippa Marbrook is welcome at 3 o'clock and that I shall be delighted to give her tea, but that Miss Hartfield will not be receiving callers today, or, I suspect, on any subsequent afternoon for some considerable time. Is that clear?" "Yes, my lady." "Then good day to you. Mrs. Hewitt will see you out." Edmund bowed. He hesitated. He looked, for the first time in the interview, directly at Anne. And what Anne saw in his face this time was not the script-reading boy of last week, but a young man who had, somewhere in the last 7 days, started to understand exactly what his mother and his sister had been making of his life. "Anne," he said, very low. "Edmund, I am sorry. I know you are. I will tell my mother. I will tell her what you said about choosing. I will try. That is all anyone can ask." He bowed again, more steadily, and went. When the door had closed, Anne sat down. Mr. Bickersmith, from his chair, slid the ledger out from under himself and reopened it without a word. The Duke crossed to the window and, after a moment, said quietly, without turning, "Miss Hartfield." "Yes." 3 o'clock will be a great deal more interesting than the audit can offer this afternoon. May I make a suggestion?" "Please." "We move the entire operation upstairs. Beatrice's small library on the 2nd floor. Door closed. I have a stenographer's notebook in my coat. We continue our work uninterrupted. Beatrice receives Lady Philippa alone." "Beatrice alone? With Philippa?" The Duke turned at last. He was, Anne saw with a small, surprising flicker of pleasure, actually smiling. A thin, very contained smile that reached the eyes only. "Miss Hartfield, I know you have been with my sister only 10 days, but I have lived with my sister for 24 years. I should like, for once in my life, to be in the room above the room when Beatrice receives a woman who has come to bully one of her people. I shall not interrupt. I shall not, however, miss it. Will you join me?" Anne looked at him. She thought about the 7 months of Philippa's small, wounding kindnesses and great public cruelties. She thought about all the afternoons she had spent in the Marbrook drawing room, perfectly silent, while Philippa told her how lucky she was, in her circumstances, to have been taken in. She thought about the moment last night when Philippa had leaned over the back of a chair and whispered. She thought about the little Sèvres cups, green ones, that she had dusted twice a week for 6 months, and that Philippa had once removed from her hand because she did not, she had said with a smile, trust their help to keep them safe. "Your Grace," she said, "I should be utterly delighted." So they went upstairs. They took the ledgers. They took Mr. Bickersmith. They took 2 pots of tea. They closed the door of the small library at 5 minutes to 3. And at 3 exactly, Lady Philippa Marbrook arrived, in a carriage with the Marbrook crest displayed, and was shown into the drawing room of Lady Beatrice Ashworth, and the door was closed behind her. And from the open transom above the second-floor library, the whole house listened. Lady Beatrice greeted Philippa pleasantly. She offered her tea. She poured it herself, with a kindness so perfectly judged that Anne, 2 stories above, found herself smiling helplessly into her ledger. Philippa began carefully.
Lady Beatrice, I have come, most reluctantly, on a delicate matter.
I am sure you have.
Miss Hartfield has been, under our care, for some little time. She is, I am afraid, prone to a certain instability of mood. We are, Mamma and I, most concerned that her recent flight from our house might be misinterpreted.
By whom, Lady Philippa?
By society. By the well-meaning observers of London.
I see.
It would distress me very much if it were thought that Miss Hartfield had left us under any sort of duress.
Beatrice's voice, when it came, was the same voice she had used at the breakfast table on Anne's first morning. Clear, warm, perfectly courteous. Anne had learned, in 10 days, to identify the precise note Beatrice used when she had decided to be nicer to a person than they could possibly tolerate.
"My dear Lady Philippa," said Beatrice,
"what an excellent thing it is that you have come. I have been wishing for an opportunity to set your mind quite at rest. Miss Hartfield is an old family friend. She has come to me on a long visit. There is no duress whatsoever. There is nothing to misinterpret. I cannot imagine, truly I cannot imagine, what poor friend of yours could be putting such anxious notions into your head. Have a biscuit." "Lady Beatrice, the almond ones are particularly good. Cook makes them with rose water. Lady Beatrice, I had hoped Miss Hartfield would receive me, for a few moments. Oh, my poor dear, did you not have my note? Miss Hartfield is engaged this afternoon. She is engaged most afternoons. She is, alas, not free. Have another biscuit." A small silence. Then Philippa, in a different voice, the voice Anne knew from the back stairs of the Marbrook house, the one Philippa used to the maids, said, "Lady Beatrice, we both know what is happening. I am willing to be civil. I should very much prefer not to be uncivil. Mamma is very near the end of her patience." "Is she, my dear?" said Beatrice. "How tired she must be." "There will be talk." "I should imagine there will. Talk that will damage Miss Hartfield." "My dear Lady Philippa, I have lived in London long enough to know that the moment a young woman of unprotected fortune enters a house, the talk begins. The only useful question is whose talk it will be. Yours, for example, or mine, or, should it become necessary, my brother's." A longer silence. "I see," said Philippa eventually.
"I thought you might."
"Lady Beatrice, I was raised to believe that ladies do not threaten one another over tea." "My dear," said Beatrice gently, "I have not threatened you. I have informed you. It is a different word entirely, and in this house, it is the only word I use." Philippa rose. Beatrice rose with her, the perfect hostess. There was the soft rustle, audible from above, of silk being arranged for departure. There was the polite click of a teacup being returned to a saucer untouched. "I shall give your respects to my mother," said Philippa. "Pray do." "And to my brother." "By all means." Philippa walked to the drawing-room door. She paused with her hand on the handle. "You are protecting her," she said. It was not a question. "I am keeping her," said Beatrice. "There is a difference. Good afternoon, Lady Philippa." The drawing-room door opened, then closed. The front door, downstairs, opened and closed. The Marbrook carriage rolled away down Berkeley Square. In the second-floor library, Mr. Bickersmith, who had been silently writing throughout, set down his pencil, blinked twice, and observed, with the quiet professional satisfaction of a man who has watched a master at work, "Lady Beatrice is formidable." The Duke laughed. It was the first laugh Anne had heard from him. It was a quiet, surprised, absolutely unguarded sound. He looked, for a moment, 10 years younger. "My sister," he said, "has been formidable since she was 4. Anne, at her ledger, smiled and wrote a single line in the margin in pencil, a line she did not show anyone, but that she would discover 6 months later, when she was packing the ledger to take down to Greycoat. "The kindness of women who have decided you are theirs." Then she turned the page, and they went back to work. The next escalation came on Friday. It came not from Philippa, who had, to Beatrice's quiet enjoyment, gone into a sulk and was reportedly refusing to leave her dressing room, but from Lady Marbrook herself. The Dowager wrote, on her crested paper, in her own hand, to the editor of the Morning Post. The letter was a model of injured maternal feeling. It described, at length, the strange and sudden indisposition of the dear young Miss Hartfield, and the most painful disruption this had caused to the wedding plans of her son, who has shown himself in this matter the very pattern of forbearance. The letter did not appear in the Morning Post. It did, however, find its way, via a junior clerk in the Post's offices, who had been dining the previous Tuesday at the Berkeley Square house, and who had been waiting, with delicate amusement, for exactly such a letter, onto the Duke of Ashworth's breakfast tray on Saturday morning. The Duke read it twice. He folded it. He passed it to Anne. He poured her coffee. "Read this," he said. "Then tell me whether we hold our hand or move." Anne read it. She read it twice. She set it down. "Move," she said. Beatrice, across the table, set down her own cup with the same satisfied click she had used the previous Monday. "At last," she said. "What does moving look like?" Anne asked. The Duke leaned back in his chair. For the first time since she had known him, he looked not pleased, exactly. Pleased was a word for smaller men. He looked settled, as though a thing he had been turning in his hands for a long time had at last warmed to his palm. "Moving," he said. "Looks like the audit complete by Tuesday. A private letter Wednesday from a man at the Bank of England to the Marbrooks' principal banker, requesting a quiet consolidation of their lines. A paragraph in the Gentleman's Magazine Thursday concerning irregular conveyances out of the Hartfield estate in 1815. A private interview Friday with Lord Eldon, for which Beatrice has already secured a date. And on Saturday, our presence at Lady Constance Lacey's Spring Benefit Ball, where Lady Marbrook will be, for the first time in the season, quite publicly not looked at. "All of London will be at the Lacey Ball," said Beatrice. "Lady Constance never forgives the people she does not invite. Everyone goes." "Everyone goes," said the Duke. Anne sat very still. The morning sun came through the window and caught the silver of the coffee pot. She thought of Philippa in rose-pink silk. She thought of Philippa 6 months ago, the day after Anne's first appearance at the Marbrook breakfast table, telling her, with a smile, that Anne must not feel awkward at a public ball. "People of your station are quite expected to remain seated." "Will I," said Anne carefully, "be expected to remain seated?" "Anne," said Beatrice, with a slow, delighted smile. "Anne, my darling, you will be expected to lead the second set, with my brother, who has already arranged it with Lady Constance. Lady Constance is on my list. Lady Constance has already this morning sent over the order of dances. The second set is yours." "Beatrice." "Yes?" "What am I going to wear?" "Ah," said Beatrice, "I had hoped you would ask. Madame Florine has been waiting for 10 days to be asked. I have a carriage at 12. We are going to Madame Florine's now. She has, preemptively,
set aside a length of ruby silk velvet that she thinks would not suit anyone in London but you. I told her you would not let her be wrong. Drink your coffee. We leave in 20 minutes. Madame Florine, a sharp, small Frenchwoman with the quick, exact hands of a born dressmaker, pinned the velvet at Anne's hip with a gesture so deft, Anne never saw the pin enter the cloth. The gown, when it was complete, would be the deep ruby of a glass of Burgundy held against firelight. The bodice would be modest by the standards of the season, the sleeves short and full, the only ornament a single line of dark gold trim at the hem. "You will not wear jewelry," said Madame Florine. "The throat is the gown." "My grandmother's pearl earrings," said Anne. Madame considered, then nodded once. "The pearls. Yes, the pearls are witness." In the carriage on the way home, Anne discovered a pair of dark gold dancing slippers and a small evening fan painted with white hawthorn flowers beside her on the seat, where Beatrice had quietly placed them. She turned, ready to protest. Beatrice held up one gloved hand. "Anne, we agreed that for one season I would manage on your behalf. I am managing. I am also enjoying myself enormously. The argument is closed." Anne sat with the parcel in her lap and felt something she had not felt for so long that she had to give it a moment to identify itself. It was anticipation. The Lacey Ball was held on the Saturday in a townhouse on Park Lane that had once belonged to a king's mistress, and that, in consequence, had ballroom doors so wide that a carriage could, in principle, have been driven through them. The marble floor of the entrance hall was lit by sconces. The chandelier in the great drawing room had been polished for 2 days. The orchestra, 15 pieces, brought up from Vauxhall, was already tuning when the Ashworth carriage joined the long line of carriages along Park Lane. Anne sat very still inside the carriage, between the Duke and Beatrice. She had been asked twice by Mrs. Hewitt that afternoon whether she was warm enough. She had been asked once by the Duke whether she was breathing. She had laughed then. She was breathing now, with attention, the way her father had taught her to breathe before a difficult horse. In for 4, out for 6. The ruby velvet shifted around her ankles as the carriage moved forward. The dark gold slippers caught the light from the sconces along the road. At her ears, her grandmother's pearls, her grandmother's witness, held very still. The Duke spoke, very quietly, without turning his head. "Miss Hartfield." "Your Grace." "Whatever happens in there, I want you to know one thing. 2 things. First, Beatrice and I will not leave this house until you do. If at any moment you wish to go, you have only to look at me. We will go. There is no minimum. There is no obligation. We are here because we chose to come, and we will leave when you choose to leave." "Thank you. The second?" "The second," said the Duke even more quietly, "is that you are the most dangerous person in any room you enter tonight. The Marbrooks do not know what we know. They do not know what is in Mr. Bickersmith's audit, or what was sent to the Bank of England yesterday, or that Lord Eldon is hearing a private petition on Tuesday. They believe you walked out of a ball 19 days ago in a fit of pique, and that, with sufficient pressure, you may be persuaded to walk back in. They are wrong. That asymmetry is your weapon. Use it kindly. Use it once. Use it well." The carriage stopped. The footman opened the door. The light of the Lacey townhouse fell across Anne's lap. She stepped down. The Duke followed. Beatrice followed. They went up the steps together. "Lady Beatrice Ashworth," called the majordomo. "His Grace the Duke of Ashworth, Miss Anne Hartfield." A pause, fractional, perfect, between the second name and the third. The pause was the sound of half the room turning its head. Anne walked into the ballroom on the Duke's right and Beatrice's left, and 100 candles caught the ruby velvet, and her grandmother's pearls swung once and were still. And across the long room, where she had known they would be, because Beatrice had a copy of Lady Constance's guest list, Lady Marbrook and Lady Philippa and Lord Edmund were standing in a small island near the orchestra.
and Philippa, in cream silk and rose-coloured roses, was laughing with a dowager Anne did not know, and Philippa's laugh stopped, exactly as a clock stops. When Philippa saw who had come in, Lady Marlborough went white, and she went red. Then she composed her face, which was the face she had worn for 40 years, with the weary skill of a woman who had been composing it since before Anne was born. The orchestra struck up the first set. Anne did not watch the Marlboroughs. She watched instead the Duke. He gave her his arm. She took it this time. They walked together down the side of the ballroom, past the long row of gilt chairs, past the open windows that gave on to the dark spring garden, past the punch table where the dowagers had collected. And they stopped, exactly where Beatrice had told them to stop, at the edge of the dance floor, where Lady Constance Lacy was standing with her tall, thin son. "My dear," said Lady Constance warmly, taking Anne's hand, "you are wholly and entirely welcome in my house. I should like to present you to my son, Mr. Frederick Lacy, who has been wishing for an introduction. Frederick, Miss Hartfield. Miss Hartfield, my Frederick." Frederick Lacy bowed. It was a deep bow. It was the bow of a young man who had been thoroughly briefed by his mother about which young woman this evening was being publicly received. "Miss Hartfield," he said, "the honour is mine." Anne curtsied. The first set was forming. She gave her hand to the Duke for the second, as Beatrice had arranged, and she and the Duke took their place at the head of the floor, exactly opposite the place where the Marlboroughs were standing, and Lady Constance, with the calm, steady deliberation of a great hostess making a permanent statement, began the dance herself, with a partner of her own choosing, and the orchestra moved into the first figure, and London, almost the whole of London, saw that Miss Anne Hartfield, niece by marriage of nobody in particular, was tonight standing up in the second set with the Duke of Ashworth. The Marlboroughs did not move. The dance began. Anne had not danced in 11 months. The figures came back to her at once. They had been taught in her mother's drawing room by a master from London who had despaired of her cousin and adored her, and she found her feet without effort. The Duke, she discovered, was an excellent dancer. He did not show off. He did not lead her too firmly. He moved like a man who had taken trouble in his youth to make himself adequate at a thing he had not, by nature, found easy. In the third figure, when they passed close, he said, under his breath without looking at her, "Philippa is leaving." "Already?" "With her mother. They are walking towards the door. Lord Edmund is staying." "Is he?" "He is." A turn brought them apart. A turn brought them back. "Anne," said the Duke, her name for the first time, the unaccented Anne, "look at me." She looked. They were turning under the chandelier. The candlelight ran along his jaw and across the silver embroidery on his waistcoat and into the grey of his eyes. "Anne, I'm not going to declare anything tonight. I'm keeping a promise. But I would like, when this is over, when Greycoat is yours, when you are no longer in any way a person who needs my protection, I would like very much to ask you a question. I do not require your answer now. I wished only to say so that the question, when it comes, will not surprise you." "It will not surprise me, Your Grace." "Theo." "It will not surprise me, Theo." The figure ended. They returned to the head of the line. The orchestra struck the second set. Lord Edmund Marlborough, at the edge of the floor, watched them with the eyes of a young man who was, perhaps for the first time in his life, actually seeing something. The dance went on. Philippa and her mother left the Lacy ball at 10 minutes past 10, without taking their leave of Lady Constance, which in the world of Berkeley Square was the social equivalent of striking the hostess. Lady Constance, the next morning, would write a single line about it in her journal. The Marlboroughs departed before the supper dance. I shall not, I think, ask them again. Anne danced the second and the fourth and the supper sets. She was introduced to a great many people, all of whom had been quietly briefed by Beatrice, and all of whom addressed her as Miss Hartfield of Greycoat. The phrase was new. By midnight, it had circulated the entire ballroom. By the following Tuesday, it would be in 3 columns of the Morning Chronicle. Anne did not dance with Lord Edmund. He did not ask her. What he did, instead, was, at 11:30, while the supper dance was forming, cross the ballroom in his quiet, soft-shouldered way, stop in front of Anne where she stood with Beatrice by an open window, bow, and say, in a clear, controlled voice that was entirely his own, and not his mother's, "Miss Hartfield, I have informed my mother this evening that I will not under any circumstances pursue any cause of action against the Duke of Ashworth, or against yourself in connection with the broken engagement. I have informed her that I regard the engagement as having been ended by my own decision, on grounds of irregularities in the family's financial conduct of which, to this point, I have not been fully aware, but which I now choose to acknowledge. I wished, before any of this becomes public, to say so to you in person. I hope very much that you will accept my apology." Beatrice, at Anne's elbow, said nothing. The room around them, sensing the small, charged quiet, drew back a half-step. Anne extended her hand, not for a bow, not for a kiss, but as one extends a hand to a person one has decided to forgive. "Lord Edmund," she said, "I accept." He took her hand. He bowed over it. He did not kiss it. He returned it. "I shall not trouble you again," he said. "I do not believe you will be a trouble." He bowed once more. He walked, alone, and now visibly alone, in a way nobody in the room could mistake, across the ballroom and out through the doors into the night, where his own carriage was waiting. The carriage moved off down Park Lane. London noted, in the way that London noted things, that Lord Edmund Marbrook had, between 11:30 and 11:45 on the night of Lady Constance Lacy's spring ball, chosen to leave his mother and become, from that evening, a person who would have to make his own decisions. The Duke, returning from the supper room with a glass of lemonade for Anne, watched Edmund go. "Well," he said. "Well," said Anne, "he will not be ruined." "No." "He may even be useful." "He may." The Duke handed her the lemonade. She took it. Their fingers met around the cool stem of the glass and remained there a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Beatrice, from a tactful 3 feet away, examined a piece of the wallpaper with sudden professional interest. Anne drank her lemonade. The orchestra began the supper dance. The Duke took the empty glass from her, set it down, and gave her his hand again. She took it. They went onto the floor. In Berkeley Square, in a small library on the 2nd floor, on a desk under a tied bundle of correspondence, a single sheet of cream-coloured parchment lay folded in 3 with a Treasury seal upon it. It had been delivered that afternoon by a private messenger from Lord Eldon. It bore, on its outer fold, 6 words in Eldon's dry, exact hand. Tuesday, 10 in the morning. Granted. Greycoat was, although Anne did not yet know it, on the floor of the Lacy ball, in ruby velvet, dancing with Theodore Ashworth under 1,000 candles. 5 days, 6 hours, and 40 minutes from being hers. Tuesday came in a soft grey rain. Anne dressed at 7:30 in a dark blue travelling gown. Mrs. Hewitt, who had risen at 6 to lay the fire, brought her chocolate without being asked. Beatrice, in a wrapper, came along the corridor at 7:45 and tied a small spray of dried lavender to the cuff of Anne's left glove. "For courage." "I have courage." "The style, then." The Duke's carriage was at the door at 20 minutes to 9. The Duke himself was standing on the pavement in a long grey overcoat, with his hat held behind him, the way Anne had learned in 3 weeks he stood when he was waiting, and did not wish to be observed waiting. He handed her up. He climbed in. The carriage moved off down Berkeley Square in the soft, persistent rain, towards Whitehall and the Court of Chancery, and Lord Eldon. In the carriage, Anne said, "If I cry in court." "You will not cry in court." "If I do." "Then you will cry in court." said the Duke, "and Lord Eldon will be moved, and he will give us our judgment a quarter of an hour earlier than he had intended, and Mr. Bickersmith will fold his handkerchief into your hand, without anyone seeing him do it. If you cry, Anne, you cry. There is no rule against it. There is, however, a rule against apologizing for it, and I shall enforce that rule personally." Anne laughed. She did not cry. She did not cry, either, when Lord Eldon, a small, dry, exhausted man with hair like grey wire, read out the judgment. The irregular conveyance of the Greycoat estate, dated the 14th of October, 1815, vacated as a forgery. The property reverting entirely to Anne Hartfield, daughter and only issue of the late Henry Hartfield. All costs adjudged against the estate of Lady Marlborough and her son. The matter referred to the Crown for further consideration. She did not cry then. She made a small bow, in which her grandmother's pearls swung once, and were still. And she said, "Thank you, my lord." Lord Eldon looked at her over his spectacles. He inclined his head, the merest fraction of an inch. "Miss Hartfield," he said, "your father was a friend of my father. He stood for me at my christening. I am personally glad." "My lord?" "Go and see your house, Miss Hartfield. It has been much missed." She did not cry there, either. She cried in the carriage, briefly, on Whitehall. 3 minutes only. The brief, sharp, silent cry of a woman who has been working for 19 days at something that has gone exactly the way she planned, and who needs 3 minutes alone in a moving carriage with a man who has been settling a debt to her father since 1815, to allow her face to admit it. The Duke handed her a handkerchief. He handed her, from the seat beside him, a small flask of Madeira. He poured her a thimbleful in a silver cup. "Drink," he said. "I do not drink." She drank. The Madeira was warm and slightly sweet. The carriage rocked over the cobbles past Banqueting House. The rain on the carriage roof was the rain her father had ridden through to find a young man with no money and a dying mother in 1808. She did not say anything for several minutes. When she did, what she said was, "When can we go and see it?" "Greycoat." "Greycoat." "Tomorrow," said the Duke, "if you wish." "I wish." "Then tomorrow." "With Beatrice." "With Beatrice." "And Mr. Bickersmith." "And Mr. Bickersmith. He has, I should warn you, already packed." She laughed. The laugh came out a little ragged. It was, she realized, the first sound of her own laughter in a very long while, and she let it run. That night, in the Blue Room in Berkeley Square, Anne could not sleep. It was not exhaustion. It was the opposite of exhaustion. A low, thrumming current under her skin, a kind of quiet electric attention that her body had not known how to discharge. The case had been won. The judgment had been read out. Lord Eldon had inclined his head. Mr. Bickersmith had folded his handkerchief into her hand without looking. Greycoat was hers, in fact and in law, in a way that no Marlborough signature, forged or otherwise, could now disturb. By every reasonable accounting, she should have slept like a stone. Instead, she sat at the small writing desk in her dressing gown, with the candle low, and she looked at her father's miniature, and she did not look away. The miniature lay open in its little leather case on the blotter. Henry Hartfield, 26, looked back at her in oils, clean-shaven, clear-eyed, a thin line at the corner of the mouth where a lifetime's habit of not quite smiling had already begun. The portrait had hung in her father's dressing room until 1815, and had then disappeared, into one of the Marlborough trunks, she now knew, and out of one of those trunks into a drawer of the Blue Room, on the morning after she had walked out. She had not, until tonight, taken it out. She had not been ready. She turned the miniature, slowly, in its case. The back was the back of any miniature. Green-grey velvet, somewhat moth-mottled, with a small oval of glass set into it, under which her mother had, at some point in the 1790s, slipped a single curl of dark hair, tied with a thread of gold silk. Anne had known about the car since she was 9. She had not, until tonight, looked at it closely. Now she did. The thread of gold silk, on close attention, was not a thread of gold silk. It was a single fine line of writing on the smallest possible strip of paper, rolled tight as a needle, and only the gold-painted end of it had been visible from outside the glass. Her mother, her quiet, careful mother, who had read Maria Edgeworth and trained roses and made brown bread, and who had, as it now appeared, possessed one further small private competence, had hidden, in the back of the miniature, a paper she had wished her daughter to find. Anne looked at the curl of hair and the little gold-painted spike of paper for perhaps 90 seconds. Then she stood up. She crossed the room. She opened the writing desk's lower drawer, took out the small horn-handled penknife she had used as a girl, sat down again and, with the slow, exact attention of a surgeon who had learned to keep her hand still through harder things than this, eased the back of the case open. The little gold-painted strip slid out into her palm. She unrolled it. There were 11 words. Greycoat is yours. The house, the land. Look in the long gallery. Her mother's hand, older than the portrait. Hurried, but not panicked. Anne sat very still. She had known, of course, that Greycoat was hers. The afternoon's judgment had said so in 5 paragraphs of dry court Latin. But this small note, written, by the look of the hand, perhaps 3 weeks before her mother's last illness in 1814, and slipped into the back of a portrait of a man already a year gone by then, said something different. The Marbrooks had, at the time of her mother's death in 1814, not yet seized Greycoat. The forged conveyance was dated 1815, 6 months after both parents were gone. Whatever her mother had meant by the long gallery had been hidden before the Marbrooks came. It had been waiting, undisturbed, for an unspecified daughter, for an unspecified day. The candle made its small, steady sound. Outside in Berkeley Square, a single late carriage went past, its wheels muffled on the cobbles by some recent rain. The London bells counted out the half-hour after midnight. Anne folded the small paper in half. She slid it, very carefully, into the back of her father's miniature, beside the curl of hair, and pressed the case shut. She set the miniature in the center of the blotter. She blew out the candle. She did not sleep at once, but she sat for a long time in the dark of the blue room, with her hands folded in her lap, looking at the dim suggestion of a bedpost against the curtain. And what she felt, for the first time in 11 years, was not loss. It was an instruction. She had been left an instruction. In the small hours, somewhere between 3 and 4, she finally slept, and her last thought before sleep was the long, unbroken row of 8 tall windows in the Greycoat Long Gallery, the way the light came through them in the late afternoon, and the way her mother, slim, dark-haired, never very still, had liked to walk that gallery before dinner, with one hand drawn lightly along the panelling, counting, as she went, the small carved roses set into the wood. They set out the next morning at first light. The carriage rolled out of Berkeley Square in the pale watered grey of 5:30, milk carts and night soil men still moving in the thin London dawn, and by the time the 4 horses had reached Hyde Park Corner, the first edge of cold blue had begun to show along the eastern roofline. Anne sat by the window, with her gloved hands tucked into the deep pocket of her travelling cloak, and watched the city give way, in long, quiet stages, to country. Beatrice, opposite, was making a list on a small pad balanced on her knee. The Duke, beside Anne, was reading a letter. Anne breathed in slowly, 4 counts. She breathed out, 6. She had not, until the carriage moved, allowed herself to know that she was afraid. "Anne," said Beatrice without looking up, "you are breathing in the wrong rhythm. You are breathing as though you were about to swim a long way underwater." The Duke turned a page of his letter. Without looking up, he said, mildly, "Beatrice, leave her alone. She is breathing as her father taught her to breathe. It is the breathing for difficult horses. It is excellent breathing." Beatrice subsided into her list with the dignified muttering of a woman whose advice has been overruled by the exact authority she had appealed to. Anne felt her mouth lift very slightly at one corner. By Staines they had crossed the Thames. The road climbed onto Surrey heathland, dropped through the long beechwood at Hook, climbed again towards the bleached chalk country above Basingstoke. Anne sat with her hands folded and watched the country come towards her. Fields of new green wheat, hedges thick with cowparsley. She did not weep. The country was the country of her childhood, and her childhood had not gone anywhere. It had simply waited for her. Andover came towards them at 4 in the afternoon. The Star, a coaching inn with a courtyard of cobbled brick, around which trailed a remarkable old white rose, now coming into the first of its bud, took them in with the slightly anxious enthusiasm of an innkeeper who had been told, 3 days previously, that a duke was to come. While Beatrice went out to the kitchen to discuss with the cook the duck for which the Star was famous, Anne walked alone the small distance to the courtyard rose. It was a tall, leggy old Gallica that had been planted in the yard before the war with France. She had not seen it since she was 14, when her father had brought her here on the way to Salisbury for a horse fair. It was the same rose. The country had not gone. She had been about to turn from the rose to go back across the courtyard when Mr. Bickersmith came out of the small side door of the inn at a quicker pace than she had ever seen him take. He had a folded paper in his hand, and the slightly frowning expression of a man whose long professional habit of not being surprised by paperwork had for once been disturbed. "Miss Hartfield." "Mr. Bickersmith?" "There is a letter for you, under cover. The landlord says it was brought by a private rider at 1 o'clock this afternoon. Sealed, addressed to Miss Hartfield. Expected to lodge tonight at the Star, Andover. The rider would not give a name, he would not eat. He paid for the letter's keeping and rode out at once." He held out the paper. Anne took it. The hand on the outer cover was Edmund Marbrook's. She knew it at once. Round, soft-shouldered, slightly hesitant at the start of every word. Exactly as he wrote it. She broke the seal. The letter was short. "Anne, I came home last night to a long discussion in the back drawing room. My mother has written to a man at the bank named Mr. Travers. She is proposing, in the event that the Greycoat case goes against us, to attempt a private compromise with Travers, under which certain Marbrook obligations would be sold across to a continental house she has been corresponding with under another name. I do not know the foreign house. I do not approve of it. I thought you should know. Marbrook." Anne read it twice. She folded it. "Mr. Bickersmith, Miss Hartfield. Please ask the landlord whether the rider is still in the town. If he is, do not approach him. Simply find out. Then come to me. I shall be in our parlor." Mr. Bickersmith bowed and went. Anne walked with the letter folded small in her gloved hand, back across the cobbled yard. The rider was no longer in the town. Mr. Bickersmith reported this 20 minutes later, with the calm professional satisfaction of a man whose enquiry had been brief and successful. The rider had taken a fresh horse and was already 3 hours along the southward road. Anne sat for a moment with the letter in her lap. Then she gave it to the Duke, who read it through once, and read it through again, and folded it, and laid it carefully on the table. "Edmund," he said slowly, "may turn out to have been the most useful person in this house after all." "He may." "I shall write to Whittaker tonight. He will speak to the bank in the morning. Lady Marbrook will discover, before luncheon, that no London bank will purchase her obligations onward to any continental house, named or unnamed, without first consulting the holder of record. Which is to say, me. The continental door is closed before she has reached it." "Tonight?" "Tonight." Anne folded her hands in her lap. "Theo, he did not need to send this letter. He might be ruined for sending it." "He might, and yet he sent it." Beatrice, coming back from the kitchen smelling magnificently of duck and orange, saw their faces and stopped at the door. The Duke handed her the letter. Beatrice read it. "Move Lord Edmund Marbrook," she said, in the voice of a woman silently revising a list, From the column of acquaintances under suspended judgment to the column of young men deserving an invitation. It is not sentiment, Theodore. It is information. That night, Anne slept for 9 hours under a coverlet of old white linen embroidered with daisies, with the smell of the white rose coming faintly in at the half-open window. They left Andover at 7 and were on the long, open chalk road westward by the time the sun had cleared the elms. The country grew flatter and broader as they came down out of Hampshire into Wiltshire. Anne began to recognize the shapes of fields, the bends of streams, the long, low backs of hills she had ridden as a child on a stout bay pony called Honesty. She did not say the names aloud. She felt them go past inside her, the way a bell rings inside a stone tower without anyone having struck it. They turned south at the crossroads above Stowford. The road became narrower, walled with high hedges of whitethorn just beginning to flower. A milestone appeared on the verge. Greycoat, 2 miles. Anne put her hand, very briefly, against the inside of the carriage door. Beatrice, without saying anything, without looking, laid her gloved hand on top of Anne's, and left it there for the count of perhaps 8, and then withdrew it, and went back to her list. The Duke, who had set aside his letter half an hour before, sat very still and watched Anne's face in the corner of his vision, with the quiet, undisturbing attention of a man observing the moment in which a friend comes back to a place she has not seen for 11 years. The road dipped through a small wood. It rose, it curved, and on the rise, to their left, between 2 great horse-chestnuts already in their candle of white spring flower, the long, grey stone front of Greycoat came into view at last across the green of the home pasture, with the slow rooks going home over the high beechwood that lay east of the chapel, and the soft May light on the stone of the south front. They arrived at the gate at 2:30. The lodge clock, Anne noticed without surprise, because some things will keep time without a master, was 4 minutes slow. Anne stepped down from the carriage at the gate. The lodge-keeper's wife, a Mrs. Pierce, who had been 9 years old when Anne was born, and who was now 63, came out of the lodge-house, and, on seeing Anne, who had her mother's auburn hair and her father's straight back, and was wearing her mother's pearl earrings, sat down quite suddenly on the lodge bench and put her apron over her face, and wept. She wept for a full minute. Then she stood up, dried her face, took Anne by both shoulders, and said, "Welcome home, Miss. Mrs. Pierce. Welcome home." Anne walked, with Mrs. Pierce on one side and the Duke at a respectful 3 paces behind, up the long drive to the south front. The drive had ruts. The lawn had not been cut for weeks. A pane in one long gallery window had been mended with paper. None of this surprised her. The bones of the house, the warm grey stone, the stepped gables, the long avenue of limes behind the chapel, were as she had remembered them every night, in every dream, since the carriage that had carried her north to the Marbrooks had taken its last look at this drive in March of 1815. She walked into the entrance hall. The flagstones were the flagstones. The umbrella stand was the umbrella stand, an ugly carved bear holding out a brass tray, a thing her father had brought home as a joke from a sale in Salisbury when she was 6. The bear was still there. She put her hand on the bear's nose, briefly. The brass was cold. Then she walked through the long gallery to the library, and the library was, yes, the library. Bookshelves to the ceiling, with the gaps where the Marbrooks had taken away the 4 volumes of her father's Pliny and the 3 volumes of her mother's Maria Edgeworth. But otherwise, the library, with the Indian red carpet, with the high tall window that looked out onto the rose garden, with the scratched ink stain in the shape of a dog on the corner of the great table where her father had spilled an inkpot in 1810 and refused to have the table revarnished because, he had said, it was now an improvement. The ink-stained dog was still there. Anne sat down in her father's chair at the table. She did not cry. She had cried in the carriage on Whitehall. She had run out, that day, of crying. Instead, she pressed both hands flat onto the cool surface of the table beside the ink-stained dog and breathed in the smell of beeswax and old book paper and, through the open window, the cold green smell of the box hedges in the rose garden, which she had not smelt in 11 years, and which she had not, until that moment, allowed herself to remember she missed. Behind her, the Duke of Ashworth said, very quietly, "Anne."
"Theo."
"Stand where you mean to be standing." She turned to look at him. He had stopped just inside the doorway. He was holding his hat against his chest, and he was, she saw, holding it the way a young man holds a hat at a funeral. His face was, for once, perfectly readable. A man who had spent 11 years repaying a debt, and who had, in this moment, in this room, finished repaying it.
"I am standing where I mean to be standing,"
Anne said. "Yes."
"Thank you, Your Grace."
"Theo."
"Thank you, Theo."
They looked at each other across the Indian red carpet. Beatrice, in the doorway behind him, said briskly,
"Mrs. Pierce, my dear, is there a tea kettle in this house?" "There is, my lady." "Then for the love of all that is holy, let us put it on. Theodore, stop standing about. Anne, my darling, I have a list. Mr. Bickersmith, get out the inventory. Greycoat, listen to me. Greycoat needs running."
They stayed at Greycoat 3 days. In those 3 days, the household, the Pierces, an old gardener named Tom Webb, a half-blind cat named Mrs. Whittaker, gathered around Anne the way bees gather around a queen returning to a hive long queenless. The broken window was measured for new glass. The roses were pruned by Anne herself, with her mother's old secateurs. Henry Hartfield's grave was found exactly where Anne had left it 11 years before, with a single sentence. He was generous. On the second morning, Anne walked the long gallery alone. It ran the whole length of the south front, 8 tall sash windows on one side, 8 panels of dark oak on the other. The floor, a long, unbroken stretch of Cornish slate that her mother had insisted on, against the advice of every architect available between Salisbury and Bristol. The morning sun came in through the 8 windows in 8 clean rectangles. The dust danced in them. Anne walked from the eastern end to the western end, with her hand drawn lightly along the panelling, counting, as her mother had counted, the small carved roses set into the wood. There were 48 roses. She had counted them as a child. She had counted them now. She did not know. She had not, then, allowed herself to know what she was counting them for. She knew now. Somewhere along the panelling, a rose had to differ. She walked the gallery a second time. She walked it a third time. On the fourth pass, she walked it slowly, with the very tips of her fingers. And on the fourth pass, at the center of the western half, on the third panel from the chimney-piece, one of the small carved roses moved very slightly under her fingers when she pressed it. The carving had been hinged. The hinge was tight, but it had been used once and had been put back without locking. She slid the rose aside. Behind it, there was a small recess, perhaps 8 inches deep, perhaps 4 wide. A single tied bundle of papers, wrapped in oilcloth. Anne took the bundle out. She sat with it on the long oak window seat and opened it slowly. The original Greycoat deed, intact, under her father's hand, and the crown seal of 1798. 3 letters her father had written to her mother during the war. A sheet of every Greycoat tenant's rent for 10 years past in her mother's clear copperplate. And one further, small, folded paper that she put aside, in the deepest pocket of her travelling cloak, to read alone, later. She replaced the rose. She tested it twice. It held. She wrapped the rest of the bundle and went down to the library, where Mr. Bickersmith was already at the great table with the home farm receipts, and she set the original deed in front of him, without speaking. Mr. Bickersmith took it up, put on his spectacles, looked at it again, and said softly, "Your mother was a thorough woman." She was. It is useful, occasionally, to have been raised by thorough women. That evening, in her father's chair in the library, with a single candle, Anne opened the second small folded paper. It was a list, in her mother's hand, the names of 3 neighbours of the Hartfields in 1813, who had, her mother believed, been party to the proposed transfer. Beneath the names, her mother had written, None of these men is to be ruined. They are merely to be informed that the inheritance was always to be Anne's. M.H. March 1814. Anne folded the paper and set it beside the miniature. She would follow her mother's instruction. She would not ruin 3 further families. She would simply, at some future date, send each man a polite note. She would inform. It was, she had learned in 7 months, the most useful word a woman could possess. Anne knelt at the grave. The Duke stood at the chapel door, hat in hand, 3 paces back. She did not say anything aloud. She did, however, in her head, give her father a brief and accurate report of the previous 19 days. And when she had finished, she stood up, brushed the moss off her gown, and went out into the May afternoon. The Duke was waiting. "Anne," he said gently. "Thea, I have a question." "You have?" "I have." He crossed the chapel yard. He stopped a foot from her. He took her hand, the bare hand this time, no glove, no buffer. "Anne Hartfield of Greycoat," said the Duke of Ashworth, in the slow, careful, entirely steady voice of a man who had been turning these particular words for a long time. "I am no longer in your debt. The trust is yours. The house is yours. Lord Eldon's judgment is on file. The Marbrooks are, by the close of this week, finished. There is, between us, no longer a single, practical, reason for me to wait." "No," she said, "there is not." "Will you, at some point in the next year, at any pace you choose, at any conditions you set, consider becoming my wife?" She looked at him. She thought of Philippa, leaning over the back of a chair. She thought of the Duke watching her across a long room of strangers. She thought of a carriage in a dark street, and a man who had been waiting 11 years to repay a debt he had been forbidden to speak of. She thought of a hyacinth on the corner of a ledger. She thought of her father, riding through rain in 1808 with a purse he had not been asked to carry. She thought of the words on his grave. He was generous. She thought of all of these things, in the chapel yard at Greycoat, with a man holding her bare hand. "Theo," she said. "Anne?" "I have one condition." He smiled, for the second time only that she had seen. "Name it." "You will not pay Philippa Marbrook back for what she said to me. I have already won. I do not need her to suffer. I should like her to be survived. I should like her to know, every day for the rest of her life, that I am living an excellent life that she had hoped to deny me, and that I am not wasting a single hour of that life on her. Can you live with that?" "Yes." "Then yes," said Anne. "I will marry you, at any pace, on any terms, with great pleasure. Yes." The Duke of Ashworth, Theodore, kissed her in the chapel yard at Greycoat, in May, in 1819. It was a careful, slow, entirely unhurried kiss. The kiss of a man who had been holding his hand from a thing for a great deal longer than he had been holding his hand from this. Her grandmother's pearls swung once at her ears, and were still, and the rooks went home over the high beechwood. Beatrice, who had been standing in the chapel doorway with Mr. Bickersmith, for purposes, she said, of professional supervision, turned around and walked, very quickly, the long way back to the house. They were married at Greycoat in the chapel on the 18th of June. It was a small wedding. Beatrice was bridesmaid. Mr. Bickersmith gave the bride away. He had asked for the honour with great delicacy, and had wept exactly once during the rehearsal, and not at all during the ceremony itself. Mrs. Pierce held the prayer book. The cat, Mrs. Whittaker, slept on a cushion in a side pew. Anne wore a gown of pale ivory silk, no ornament, her grandmother's pearls. The Duke wore a coat the colour of the deep blue of an early summer sky after rain. They exchanged their vows. The parson, an old man who had baptized Anne, pronounced them married. They walked together out of the chapel into the chapel yard, where the rooks had not yet woken, and where the morning sun was beginning to come up over the high beech wood. Lord Edmund Marbrook was not there. He had written a careful, brief, proper letter of congratulation from Sussex, where, Beatrice's network reported, he had taken a small house and was working with a new steward to settle what remained of his family's estate, and had begun to study, with a tutor, the management of land. He would, Beatrice's letters reported, be a serviceable man eventually. Eventually, Beatrice wrote, is more than his mother ever was. Lady Marbrook had, by the end of May, quitted London for Bath. Lady Philippa had been seen in Bath on her mother's arm, in a gown that the Bath Chronicle did not describe with any kindness. Anne did not, day by day, trouble to think of them. In the way of people one has finally outlived, they had simply stopped. 6 months after the wedding, on a cold, bright December afternoon at Greycoat, Anne was seated at her father's table in the library, working through a sheaf of receipts from the home farm, when Theo came in, carrying a single small white hyacinth, forced in the glasshouse Mrs. Pierce had restored, and set it at the corner of her ledger. Anne looked up. "You have been doing this," she said, "for almost 8 months." "I know." "It is winter. You cannot be cutting these out of doors." "I have a glasshouse." "You have a glasshouse for hyacinths." "I have a glasshouse," said the Duke of Ashworth, sitting down on the corner of the table beside her, "for one specific person who once worked at this exact desk on a Marbrook ledger in the spring, and who looked up from the column once when I came in, and made me realize I had been waiting 15 years for that look. The hyacinths are merely the operational expression of the policy." "That is the most pompous sentence you have ever spoken." "I know." "I love it." "I know." He kissed her, gently, briefly, and stood up, and went out, and Anne sat for a moment with her hand resting on the cool cream column of the small white hyacinth, and her eyes on the slanting winter light coming through the long library window onto the Indian red carpet, and the ink-stained dog on the corner of the table, and the rooks going home over the high beechwood. She did not, in that moment, remember Philippa Marbrook. Some hours later, putting the candle out and closing the ledger, and walking the long stone passage to the bedroom that had been her mother's and that was now hers, she remembered, briefly, the whisper at the back of the chair. "Leave before you embarrass us." She smiled. She had left. She was not embarrassed. Greycoat was hers. The rest of her life was hers, and she meant, in fact, to be standing in it. She blew out the candle. If you have ever stayed long enough to be told to leave by people who had never once asked you to stay, you know the particular silence that comes after. And you know, too, that the truest revenge is not the pain you give back, it is the life you build afterwards, quietly, with the sort of friends who keep lists in your favor and who arrive at your door at 1 a.m. with a fire and a tray and no questions. May we all have such friends. May we all walk through the marble vestibule into the spring night and discover that the carriage we did not know was waiting. Stand where you mean to be standing. I shall see you by the fire. Good night.